Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts Podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries here every 2 weeks talking about two different texts from the Bible. This is the final episode of our second season. It's about the miracles of Jesus, and this is episode 20, and it's called Lazarus Part 2.
Well, David, we are back in John chapter 11. I've been so excited about getting back to this. And in our previous podcast, we sort of delved into chapter 11, worked our way through the story. If our listeners want the full reading of that text, then the previous podcast will help with that. But we are jumping straight in. And we had reached the stage, an incredible moment where Martha engages with Jesus. Although she's got her timings on the resurrection a little bit wrong, there's a belief that Lazarus will rise from the dead. She makes this incredible confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and then immediately goes off and gets Mary and brings Mary to Jesus. And we're sort of picking it up really from that point where Mary rushes, gets up quickly and goes to Jesus, and she then engages with Jesus. So we're at a beautiful moment in that story.
And something that spotted when I was reading through the text was this sort of, I was going to say similarity, but it's more than similar, it's the same. Both Martha and Mary say exactly the same thing to Jesus. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's quite interesting, just the same statement is made. So there's this belief in Jesus that's very present there. Whereas you think back to chapter 5, Jesus says to the guy, well, hey, do you want to be well? And the guy's response is, well, nobody will help me get into the water. Yeah. So, yes, I want to be well, but I don't see Jesus as a mechanism of me being well. The blind man in John chapter 9, he's like, well, yeah, I'd believe in this Messiah if you could tell me where he was. And Jesus is like, that's me. The man hasn't figured that out. The woman at the well, well, yeah, you don't really understand. How are you going to draw water? You don't have anything to draw water with. So this little tweak in this story, to me anyway, John, is if you had been here, my brother would not have died. This is this very clear logic from Mary and Martha. Jesus can solve this issue for us, which puts them in rarefied space in John's miracle stories.
It does, and I think it leans into, again, the idea of the intimacy of the relationship this family have with Jesus. It's more than just friends. They are absolutely disciples. They are opening up their home to him. They are affording hospitality to him. They are supporting him. Certainly, we see him showing up at Bethany in their home on a number of occasions. So these are people that will have had privileged space with Jesus. They will have heard inside conversations, inside stories, and they've clearly got it. I mean, they have absolutely got it. And for those that listen to our previous nuance and your little reflection on the beloved disciple, whether you go all the way with that or not, you've certainly got traction that you've got three people here who get Jesus. They understand who he is. And the fact that Martha's words in verse 21 and Mary's words in verse 32 are identical means they've probably reflected on this. They've talked about this. You talked about that 4-day gap and where is he? Why isn't he here? If he was here, Lazarus wouldn't be sick. If he was here, Lazarus wouldn't die. So you've got two women of tremendous faith within this. And just for me, David, a lovely little nuance. I think I lent into this in the previous podcast, but let me just repeat it again in case I didn't say it. There's a beautiful contrast for me from Luke 10 to John 11 and Mary, where in Luke 10, Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus. And then here we have in verse 32, it says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. I'm quite moved by that. I'm quite touched by that. There's something gloriously spontaneous, pure, beautiful, faith-driven by this. This isn't just the action of a desperate woman, but this is someone who really knows whose feet she is falling at. You don't get the sense of erratic desperation here. You get the sense of, it's Jesus. I need to get to Jesus. I need to get to Jesus right now. And the fact that she then confesses, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. There's something tender and deep. This is not, it's not the behavior of someone who's angsty with Jesus. This is someone who's so relieved Jesus has turned up. And there's something beautifully tender in that moment where she falls at his feet. And Jesus' reaction when he saw her weeping, and those also with her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. So there's a reaction to Mary that you're not getting to Martha. Martha seems to be much more controlled in her reaction to Jesus. It's a phenomenal, as you alluded to in our previous podcast, theologically clear conversation. Martha seems to be resigned and in control, whereas when Mary comes, the whole emotion of the story explodes.
Yes,
it goes to a whole different level, and it might point. I don't want to overcook this for our listeners. It might point to, even within this wonderful family, there are different levels of intimacy that Jesus has with this family. You know what it's like. You can meet people and have a deeper connection with one member of the family than the other, and yet you love them all.
Yes.
And could that be what's going on here? There's something deeply emotional and worshipful in Mary's reaction and Jesus' reaction to Mary that you're not seeing in Martha, and yet Martha is just as beautiful. It's just different. It's different.
Yes.
And isn't it gorgeous? It allows for that. It allows for a Martha to react in her way and is totally accepted and loved, and Mary to react in her way and draw a response from Jesus. I just think there's just a gorgeous nuance in there.
And I think you're supposed to track that in the story. I don't think this is pointless narrative. Sometimes you read stories and you're given details, and you're sort of like, well, why am I given all these details? I think I've said it before. I feel like John is the Christopher Nolan of gospel writers, that every time you watch a Christopher Nolan movie, you see something else that you realize, I should have spotted that the first time. We mentioned it in the previous episode. 3 occasions, 3, 5, and 36, there's an allusion to the love that this group of people have for each other.
Yes.
So when you have this, when you keep getting an arrow pointing at it, going, hey, look, by the way, they loved each other, I don't think you're supposed to then ignore the fact that they love each other. I don't think you're supposed to go, well, I don't think that's relevant. There's clearly escalating senses of the fact that they love each other, right?
Yeah, so beautiful. So beautiful.
So they come to the tomb. And the story just keeps going and keeps giving us so much to talk about, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and for me, there's a gorgeous little, I suppose, in the build up to the tomb for me, David, and I wanted to hear your reflections on this. We've got in verse 33, verse 35, verse 36, and then in verse 38, references to deep emotion. So let me just allude those for our listeners. Verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. We can reflect on that. Verse 35, Jesus, I mean, at Sunday school I was told, shortest verse in the Bible. Yeah, we get all that, but that's not the point of the shortest verse in the Bible. It's the fact that, my goodness, this is a succinct, gloriously powerful. He wept, and that doesn't happen very often in this explicit way in the Gospels. And then, of course, the reaction in verse 36. See how he loved him. So whatever way Jesus is reacting in this weeping, it is clearly interpreted by the onlookers as a deep expression of love. And in verse 38, as he gets to the tomb, Jesus once more deeply moved. Once more deeply moved came to the... I think the saturation of emotional vulnerability And can I say the word celebration? Is that too much? But it's like John, as soon as Mary comes, John's just turning this up and reveling in this incredible expression of emotion that's going on here. And of course we've seen Jesus move with compassion before, different sort of conversation, different sort of words. But here we have Jesus deeply moved, troubled, agitated in his spirit, weeping, and doing it in such a way that the crowd are going, whoa, he really, 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 really does love them. So we're getting an insight into the humanity of Jesus, which in the Johannine Gospel, which holds up the Son of Godness of Jesus, we're getting an insight into his humanity, which is one of the most explicit in the Gospel text. Would that be fair as a sort of a run of ideas?
Yes, I think so. And I want to agree and push it even a little bit more for its sort of teaching value, because Jesus there's all this emotion, like you say, it's like this highly emotionally charged piece of text. It's John 11:35 that actually interests me even further, though, because like you say, it was like that was a Sunday school question when I was in church. It's like shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35. We all knew that. Everyone has to remember a Bible verse to win a prize. Everybody chooses John 11:35. I mean, goodness, children today in church don't know what they missed. But think about this: that Jesus weeps within verses of rolling back. Like if we're taking John at his presentation, Jesus knows the process. He knows what's going on here. This has all been done to glorify God. Right? Yep. So Jesus knows that he's going to head to the tomb, open up the stone, and have Lazarus leave. And yet he cries here, which to me then tells me that the place of lament. Let me just think about this. I come from a Christian tradition that lament and pain and suffering were not something we ever reflected on. It was always the pursuit of joy and happiness. And here we have Jesus pausing, and maybe and you can be my safety net here, John. Maybe I'm throwing things in here, but Jesus has a moment of lament and grief for a situation that he knows he's about to solve. Which to me, I almost want to say this validates the place of lament in your life. It validates the place of grief. If anybody ever says, oh no, you're a Christian, you shouldn't. I went to a funeral, John, once, and somebody, don't anybody cry because we know this person's with God. And fortunately, I was down to speak at the funeral. So in a very gentle way, I corrected this in my sermon, that Jesus went to a funeral and Jesus stood by a tomb and cried. If your Christianity doesn't have the breadth to cope with lament and sadness and crying, then come to a text like this and realize that if Jesus can cry in advance of doing this miracle, I think you are allowed to have space for lament, for sadness, for weeping in your life. I mean, am I hanging too much on the shortest verse of the Bible, John?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think, again, big picture, understanding what John's about. John is writing this so that we will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. We know his God in flesh agenda. We understand he's trying to get us to see that Jesus is the Word that was with God and the Word that was God. And yet at the same time, he's presenting a profound insight into the humanity, the tenderness, the compassion, the grace, that grace and truth, that flesh and glory. It's all in that mix. So he is about to call Lazarus out of the grave, and yet the tears are streaming down his face. I just find it profoundly attractive. Honestly, if I'd have been standing in that crowd, I'd have been blubbering with him. And whether I knew Lazarus or not, it's to see this man standing, moved deeply I mean, moved deeply. I mean, troubled, agitated. There's something physical and emotional and psychological going on inside him that is so strong that it erupts in tears. Tears that catch the attention. Now, remember, everybody's crying. I mean, there's probably professional mourners in the group. That, you know, so the tears are flowing, and yet his tears get the attention of the crowd. See how he loved him. There's something. Can I say this, David? There's something that feels authentic, true, sincere, real about this, and I find this in Jesus profoundly attractive. I am attracted not only to the one who can raise the dead, but for the one who weeps for the living. I mean,
yes.
I am moved by that, and I am delighted in a God who has the power to change situations and also weep with our brokenness. And there aren't many gods who can do that. And I love that. And I'm so glad John did not rub that out. I'm so glad that John gives us this explosion of emotion before this amazing moment, because I suspect even as Jesus prays to the Father and calls Lazarus out, that the tears are still in his eyes and streaming, the tracks of them streaming down his face. And there's something, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we beheld his glory. There is the glory of the moment of the resurrection, and yet the humanity of his tears. And I find that I find that relentlessly attractive. I'm so moved by that. I want to follow this man to the ends of the earth. I want to follow. Do you know what I mean? When I look at this man in this story, I want to. Wherever you're going, I want to go with you, because this is the sort of person I want to be hanging around. The one who can raise the dead but weep for the living. And I love that. I'm struggling to control my own emotion thinking about it. So,
well, I'm trying to recall, John. I'm trying to recall the quote. So, and I can't. So forgive me. But there's a thought out there about a creator God who would enter the world via a womb, and the earthiness of this, if that's as polite a way as I can kind of describe that, but the human birth process is anything but clean and detached and distant, and can I say this gently, but what we would consider sanctified in that sense. There's pain, there's screaming, there's mess. That's when we have this phrase, which you read at Christmas time, we're coming up to Christmas time, and you'll go to a 12 lessons carol service, and somebody will open the carol service with, "And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us." And if you can, you'll be sat in a clean church hall, and it'll be very serene as a moment. Just try and remember that this moment that they've just sentenced with, "and the Word became flesh," was anything but clean, serene, and what we would recognize as a holy moment. And yet the God of the world says this is the holy moment. And of course, if you've been present at the birth of a child, which some people have been privileged enough to be, it is a holy moment, even though it's not like any other holy moment you're ever part of. But this is the God of earth and dirt and blood and snot. So the idea, when you were talking, John, I was listening to you. I was racking through my brain of all the Jesus movies I've ever seen, and the raising of Lazarus. And Jesus is never a snotty mess when he says, "Lazarus, come forth." And I'm a bearded man. The suggestion is that Jesus likely would have had a beard as well. And if you have a good cry, you can get yourself in a right mess with the beard. And you're painting this picture, and I'm imagining Jesus this kind of mess, calling Lazarus come forth. And I'm loving that, John. I'm loving that image. Not of Jesus that looks like he just went for a good hairstyle before he arrived at the tomb and his hair's blowing beautifully in the wind, but somebody coming from a moment of mourning and grief and lament. And I think that I would encourage anyone to spiral off with this sort of stuff as much as they want to. Jesus is raised in the Psalms. As part of my devotional life, I've been working through the lectionary and the daily office, which involves engaging with several Psalms in the course of a day. And so many of the Psalms, this as well, John, are so rooted in the dark and the difficult and the painful. And what I'm being constantly struck with on a daily basis is how often that's not my experience of Christian worship, for example. That in my church tradition, so often worship is all about the major notes, never the minor keys, if that's a way of saying it. And I think I don't want people to lose that sense of the reason there's so much lament in the Bible is because it's okay. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel pain and grieve from that pain. But then there's also this beautiful part of the Psalm story and the biblical story is that one of the reasons it's okay, Paul talks about us not grieving like pagans. We don't grieve like people that have no hope, because one of the reasons we can grieve as Christians is because this is incredible story, which we're about to see unfold in verse 38 onwards, aren't we? This is a story of resurrections coming.
Indeed. I think that's part of the paradox of holy lament. I think there is a sense in which we can lament and yet lament in hope. Is it Zechariah the prophet who describes God's people as prisoners of hope? And there is this beautiful understanding that even in the midst of our dark, there can be hope, and even our grieving, we can grieve in the night, but joy comes in the morning. There's these beautiful paradox, prisoners of hope, absolutely gorgeous. And it's a beautiful tension of joy and sorrow that we walk in a context of faith. Absolutely.
So then, I just want to throw out a piece of advice if you're tracking with John and I so far. We then get to verse 38 in chapter 11, and I'm going to suggest to you the only way, and I say only, and then people can ignore me completely, but the only way to read John 11 and really appreciate it as close to fully as we can is to get yourself two Bibles. and so you have to get one Bible. If you don't have two Bibles, you can always jump on the internet and read it up or get it on your Bible software or something. You need one Bible open at John 11, verse 38, and you need another Bible open at John 20 and verse 1. And what you'll have next to yourself, as John and I dive into this next section of the text, you basically have the raising of Lazarus story on one side and the Jesus resurrection story on the other side. And actually what I'm saying is quite important there, because even as I say that's not strictly true, because John 20 isn't the Jesus resurrection story. John 20 is the disciples discovering that Jesus has been raised. But there's almost definitely, and I hope you're going to agree with us, John is lining these two stories up next to each other and drawing contrasts and alertness to you, so that you're going to really, really enjoy this. You're happy with that as a way of jumping into John 11 and John 20, John?
Let's do it. Go for it. Lead the way.
So they arrive at the tomb. And if you've got both your Bibles open next to each other, or maybe you want to grab a notepad and when you're reading it yourself, make a little checklist. So Jesus comes to the tomb. He's still deeply moved. So going back to the point that John, you just don't forget that. This is a very emotional moment. And look, it's a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Mm-hmm. But when in John 20, when they arrive at the tomb, the stone's been removed from the entrance.
Come on.
So there's this little parallel right even from the open. So they come to Lazarus' tomb, there's a stone in the way. They come to Jesus' tomb, and it turns out that resurrection has already happened, right? So that's kind of interesting. And so Jesus has to take away the stone. I mean, I love that little parallel there of just simply that opening contrast of one tomb has a stone, one tomb has no stone.
Yeah.
The people have arrived, they have to move the stone away. By the time they get to Jesus, something has already happened to the stone. Do you like that, John? I love that
beautiful.
little parallel.
Yeah, I love that.
Off.
Absolutely love that. And the sense that the agency of the resurrection in John 20 is a greater power, and you have a human agency here rolling the stone away, but someone has already removed this stone and prepared the way for the resurrection,
Yes.
which we're going to enjoy. So I love that little contrast. Absolutely beautiful there. Beautiful.
But even just going back to your point about the earthiness and the humanness of this story, so Jesus has taken away the stone, and Martha objects, but for about the most earthy reason that you possibly can. And I'm going to say this here, John. It's not often that I say this because I do like modern translations, but I don't think there's a modern translation out there beats the King James on this one. So you get in the NIV, you get, "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor because he's been there 4 days." And to that beautiful piece of English prose, "by this time there's a bad odor," the King James gives you, "Lord, he stinketh."
Oh, it's been years since I've read that in the King James. I was raised on the King James, and as soon as you said that, I knew where you were going. That's why I couldn't stop laughing, because I remember that as a kid. He stinketh, absolutely. It's classic. It's absolutely classic. He stinketh, Lord. Come on now.
I've just taken you right the way back to Sunday school in Belfast,
mate,
haven't I?
You absolutely have. To memory verse competitions, to Sunday school. Oh yeah, Dr. Dave Allen, who was a lecturer in our Bible college when I went there, who's now in heaven, bless him. And David used to say, he said, you Irish boys, if you cut you open, you'll bleed Bible. And it was because, like, everywhere I went, Boys Brigade, Sunday school, we literally, there were huge prizes if you could memorize whole chunks of the text. And that's, you really literally have brought me back to there. And he stinketh. That's fantastic. I forgot all about that. That's so cool. That is absolutely so good. I love it. Yeah, come on. The old King James has got to get a mention in there. That's brilliant. And of course, it's probably worth some of our listeners may well be aware of this. And again, we're trying to touch on things that people might know or might not know. But of course, Lazarus has been in the grave in the tomb 4 days. So this is referenced twice actually in the story. So when something like that culturally gets referenced, it's always worth. Well, why is that reference? Why are they mentioning 4 days? And it's just to help our listeners that usually Jewish burial took place within 24 hours of the death, but other sources sort of indicate that there was a belief that the soul hovered over the body for 3 days after dying, and therefore the 4th day meant you were really dead, sort of thing. So now I'm exaggerating that slightly, and we are leaning into a sort of, it's not a biblical idea that there's nothing in the biblical text that would support that. But clearly the fact that John references 4 days a couple of times means it's playing in everybody's mind. And also I think John is leaning in to show us from a Jewish point of view, he really, really, really was dead. And therefore, this is not a fluky resurrection. It's not like Lazarus has revived. He really was dead.
In the absence of good modern medicines, it's quite likely that somebody who's in particularly bad state can end up being thought to be dead and maybe not actually quite be dead yet. And it's worth maybe mentioning, just so people are tracking how a Jewish burial works. And this actually will help you understand aspects of the Jesus story as well, is that the burial has a multi-stage process to that. For sure. So you embalm, you wrap the body up, and then you put it in, often you would put it in a family tomb of some sort. And the family tomb, if you had the facilities to be able to have a family tomb, there would be some sort of place in the tomb that you would lay a body. So you would wrap that body up and you would lay it there, and then people would return within a few days of the death of this and laying of this person in there, and they would then involve various embalming processes that would go on. And the idea was to allow the body to decompose in such a way that eventually you ended up with just the bones of the person, at which point you would then return again to the tomb. And you would sort of tidy up these bones, and they would get packed into some sort of container, box, pot, or something like that. They would then be shelved somewhere in the tombs. Hence the phrase "sort of buried with your ancestors." And then that space is then cleared out, waiting for the next family member to die, who will go through this process as well. Interestingly, of course, in Jesus' situation, he's put in a new tomb, so there's nobody else has ever been in there before.
Indeed.
But what we're seeing is a very classic, how do we know there's a bad odor? Because everybody's encountered what happens when you go and approach a body that is early in the stage of this decomposition process. So there's, I add that more just for the kind of historical understanding of this is not the same as digging up a grave that we're encountering here. So Martha comes back with this, there's a bad odor. Jesus returns then to say, "But did I not tell you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God?" So he reconnects the whole story back together again. And then we get this prayer from Jesus. Do you want to make any comments on the prayer, John?
Well, only from the point of view, I mean, I think it's absolutely, it's gorgeous. It says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." So the implication is that what Jesus is about to do, he's already connected to the purpose of the Father, and which leans into the stuff we've touched already about Jesus doing the will of the Father, going where the Father goes, saying what the Father says, etc. And you get this lovely idea, and I love this. "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe you sent me." So again, there's a lovely connection to Lazarus has died so that the glory of God will be manifest. Who sinned, the man or his parents, that he was born blind? Well, nobody. This is for the manifestation of the glory of God. So you get this pulling back to this idea that what you're about to see, and now even overhearing my prayer with the Father, this insight into intimacy with the Father, connecting Jesus to the Lord, to God, is creating an opportunity for the crowd to be drawn into not just what is about to happen, but how it's happening and who's doing it. And I think that's an important insight. Jesus could have very easily prayed a private prayer, or as we've seen from other miracle stories, not prayed at all. He just could have stepped forward and walked. But I think this prayer is as much not just the intimacy with the Father, but revealing the processes to the crowd of how Jesus works with the Father.
Yes, and that for me is really kind of important connections to really at some level where this sign fits into the whole narrative of John's Gospel. Then as well, we're seeing Jesus. We're seeing Jesus on point, aren't we? We're seeing him work his way through things. And I was even in this sort of scene around some of the language that we see from Jesus back in John 9 as well. We're seeing this prayer functioning almost as a reminder of all the things that Jesus has been journeying us through in this gospel. And even this, I was noticing in the Greek, that the apostolic language of "they will believe that you sent me," apostello, that we're going to see that language some real importance at various points in the conversations that are going to come after this miracle, don't we? The sense of the sending of Jesus is really significant, isn't it?
It is. "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And you're starting to see the sense of, and of course it leans back into the sort of the Johannine idea that we've reflected on. Come and see, this sense of, once we have received something from, in this case, Jesus, from the Father, or once we've received something from Jesus, we go and communicate that to others. Jesus says to the disciples in John chapter 1, verse 39, "Come and see where I am, come and see what I'm doing." Philip says to Nathanael, "Come and see." The woman of Samaria says to her friends, or well, to the villagers, come and of course, even within the John text here, you when Jesus asks where the tomb is, they say, come and see. So it's really, really interesting little connector there and it's almost like in the prayer of Jesus, we are being invited to come and see. We're being invited into, let me show you. If you've got eyes to see, if you're prepared, let's go back to the prologue. If you're prepared to recognize, if you're prepared to accept, if you're prepared to believe, if you're prepared to see what's really going on here, then you will receive the right to become children of God. And so, as we see a little bit later on in the chapter, there's a reaction to this incredible miracle where many believe, and there's also a reaction where a whole bunch of people harden their heart to Jesus on this issue. So he came to his own, and his own didn't recognize, didn't see. So even though they're being invited to come and see and come and literally hear in this respect, some are going to see and hear and some are not. And I think it's there's a beautiful poetic connection, I think, throughout that with John and what he's doing there.
So they're standing in front of this tomb where it appears, well, they're stood there, the stone has been taken away, and Jesus calls out in a loud voice. So think about this contrast between chapter 20, which we have open in one Bible, and chapter 11 here. When they arrive at the tomb for Jesus, the stone is already rolled away. The stone gets rolled away for Lazarus, but there's a really interesting piece that goes on. If you just pay attention to John carefully, you'll notice that Jesus, the stone in John 20, isn't rolled away to let Jesus out. The stone in John 20 is rolled away to let the disciples in. Right? Yeah. Whereas this stone gets rolled away to let Lazarus actually come out of the tomb, right? So now think about that then. So we've got this already, these stories are similar, but they're diverging from each other.
Yes.
Jesus then calls out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. I can't help but a quick rewind back to chapter 5, the miracle in chapter 5, verse 28, do not be amazed, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice. Again, this web of connections in John's gospel. So we're about to see somebody in a grave is going to hear the voice of Jesus. And then you get verse 44, which is possibly up there with one of the strangest scenes in Scripture. And just notice, we talked in John chapter 9 about how the man who was born blind remains known as the blind man the whole way through the story. In this story, Lazarus has been referred to as Lazarus the whole way through, but now, as he walks out of the tomb, he's referred to as the dead man.
The dead man.
Which is, I think, again, just beautiful Johannine irony. At one point, the man's not dead. He's described as the dead man.
The dead man. That is so cool. That is so cool.
So the dead man comes out, but notice this piece. His hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face.
Yes.
Okay, so you know where I'm going to go with this, John, don't you?
I do.
Do you want to take it there? You jump on that parallel.
It's absolutely gorgeous. So if you jump into chapter 20 of John, verse 6, then Simon Peter came along behind him, that's John, and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. It's just gorgeous, isn't it? It's and also as a person who's a tidy freak, I love the tidiness of that. That's really beautiful. I'm really appreciating the fact that Jesus was extremely tidy in putting things away properly. But so, yes, you go on.
So, well, hey, a couple of things just on that John. So Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. Now, I'm just going to leave that hanging out there because if you remember what we talked about in the last episode, I'm not going to say anything more about it other than to say, if my random harebrained theory in the last episode has any weight to it at all, that just makes this story even more interesting.
It
right?
does. It does. Certainly does.
So Simon Peter and the disciple, the one Jesus loved, they run into the tomb together, as you say. But now, a couple of things you can say here. The organization, the tidiness of Jesus' tomb, what that tells you is at a very practical level, this doesn't appear to have been a body that's been robbed, because
Yes.
you don't tidy up after yourself when you go in to rob a body from a tomb that's being guarded by Roman soldiers. So the fact that but also what's interesting is the cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen, as well as, so there's almost this sense that the body, maybe I'm stretching it here, John, but the body has been removed somehow from this cloth. Now, bear in mind, we're going to see Jesus again shortly, and he's able to transition between this world and the next, because he's appearing in rooms and disappearing from rooms. So I don't think we're imagining somebody's come in, taken off the grave clothes, folded them all up neatly, and put them back where they were. I think you're imagining a scene where somehow a body has disappeared from being within these linen cloths. I mean, I don't think I'm stretching it from the resurrection story.
That works for me. Absolutely works for me, and it fits well with other aspects of the resurrection. Yeah, absolutely.
But then you've got this flip side of that complete contrast to Lazarus has to kind of stumble his way out of the tomb looking like some sort of extract from the Addams Family or something like that, that he's still wrapped up and the cloth is over his face. I can't help but think John is drawing an absolutely direct parallel here. That Lazarus has Jesus call him out. The stone's open to let him out. Jesus, the stone is open to let us in, to see that the grave couldn't hold him. And yes, Lazarus is a resurrection miracle, but Jesus is, and bear in mind, he's already told it to us a few verses before in chapter 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Beautiful. So there's this double little connection going on there, which I just think is phenomenal.
It is. And of course, the other little sort of just finishing touch for that in some ways for me, just at a human level, is that someone has to help Lazarus out of the grave clothes.
Yes.
So take off the grave clothes and let him go. So though alive, he is still restricted. And of course, the John 20 resurrection tomb, however Jesus did it. And I'm totally comfortable with the idea of him, as it were, disappearing or coming through those. Yes. He doesn't need any assistance in having the grave clothes taken off him. He's able to deal with that by himself. Yes. So again, just that one final little contrast, which I think is just absolutely beautiful there. I have to say, and I couldn't resist this, and I'm going to throw it in on behalf of my Sunday school teacher. But my Sunday school teacher, when he taught me this story, he said this, and it stuck in my mind as a child. You know what? He said some cool stuff and other stuff. I can't remember half of it. But he said this. He said, Jesus said, Lazarus, come forth. Because if he had just said, come forth, all the dead bodies would have come out. Now, I'm not sure you want to go all the way with it, but you know,
some quality preaching right there.
It'll preach for you. But it stuck in my mind as a boy. Wow, Jesus was so powerful that actually he needed to name the dead man he was going to raise within that. But aside from that little theory, I do love the intimacy of the moment, Lazarus. I mean, he just could have said, come forth. He just could have shouted, come to life. But he names Lazarus. There's an intimacy even in that. And I think perhaps leaning into the sort of the weeping of Jesus, the deeply moved of Jesus, that this is not just, forgive me for saying this sounds horrible. It's not just Jesus raising somebody from the dead, but there is an intimacy in this one. Jesus has raised other people from the dead and not named them. And we've already covered those. The little girl to the young man who was the only son of the widow in Luke 7. He just speaks, get up. But to Lazarus, he calls his name. And I think that, again, touches on that beautiful intimacy of this moment that he's calling Lazarus his friend out of the grave, and it's beautiful. Yeah, I love that.
And again, this web of John's gospel, because you've got the allusion back to chapter 5. The day is coming when the dead will hear the voice. And I sometimes I wonder if that's why in verse 44, Lazarus is called the dead man. Like, I wonder if that's literally John's way of trying to just remind you of that passage, because the dead will hear his voice, and Jesus calls out in a loud voice, and the dead man heard him. Okay.
Yes.
I love that. But then just think of a web pushing forwards, Jesus' prayer, that they may believe that you sent me, right?
Yes.
So now, all the way back to John chapter 20. So finally, verse 8, it says, John chapter 20, verse 8, finally the other disciple, that's the one who Jesus loves, whoever that might be, finally the other disciple who reached the tomb first also goes inside, and he saw and believed. So there's this sense of this people, resurrection is bringing belief. So we can raise, let me just be a bit poetic, we can raise water into wine. We can raise dead people back to life. We can raise the man who can't walk to be able to walk, get up and walk. We can raise the sight of a man who was born blind. We can raise Lazarus from a tomb, because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And eventually, and one of the things I love about John 20, verse 8, which I think is just beautiful, he saw and he believed.
Yes.
What's brilliant is, what did he see?
Yeah.
He saw nothing.
Nothing.
It was, and I think it's just beautiful, because Jesus is then going to say to Thomas, "Oh, by the way, blessed is him who does not see but believes." And it just I mean, for all of the things I want to say about John's gospel, simply as a piece of writing, the way he ties this story together is phenomenal. I can only assume he must have had the biggest whiteboard ever to plan all of this language to make sure that everybody can tie all of these pieces together, because I don't want you to miss what Jesus is doing here. It's just stunning, isn't it?
It is, totally. It is, absolutely. And again, hopefully our listeners will hear the connectedness of this story. So it stands alone. Oh my goodness, does it stand alone? You could stand up and preach and teach on John chapter 11 without knowing anything else that's going on in the Gospel of John. But of course, John doesn't design it and doesn't tell it and doesn't write it as a standalone. He wants us to see all the connecting ideas. He wants us to let the threads run together, because this is a pivotal moment in the gospel. The tone of the gospel changes from this moment on. The trajectory of the gospel changes. The behavior of Jesus changes from this moment on, and we get an acceleration towards the climactic moment of Jesus' life. And it feels to me as I read John 11 that this is a massive tipping point moment within all of that. And John is doing that by design and leading us to this great climactic end to his gospel, which is absolutely magnificent.
And there's did you spot, John, just one closing comment? Did you spot the language of Jesus' final statement in verse 44? It's translated, take off the grave clothes. The Greek, loose the grave clothes. That word that we've seen pop up so many times. Loose the grave clothes and let him go. Just like at some level, like, isn't that the gospel? Isn't that, if Jesus is the resurrection and the life, then the message of Jesus to everyone is loose the grave clothes and let him go. I love that. So, John, that's it for our miracles season. We have loved talking about miracles. We've got some exciting stuff we're working on in the pipeline. So keep tracking us on social media. We're going to sort of let you know what we're doing on a few things. But thanks for listening to us as we talk about miracles. John, I've enjoyed it, and I can't wait to start something new with you very soon.
Yeah, bless you, man. It's been absolutely stunning, amazing. My heart, as they said on the way to Emmaus, the two disciples, my heart has burned within me as we've talked of Jesus. It's been absolutely stunning. Bless you, man.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. Okay, so that is it for this episode and this season, and we hope that you have enjoyed what you listened to today and also throughout the 20 episodes about miracles. We are going to be back in 2 weeks' time with a couple of episodes thinking about Christmas as that approaches, and we hope that you are going to look forward to them. If you want to get in touch with us about anything we've said throughout this series, then don't forget you can reach out to us on podcast@twotext.com. And you can also like and follow the Two Text Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. You can listen to all of our podcasts from this season and the previous season on parables over on www.twotext.com or wherever you get your podcasts. But that is it for today. We hope you'll be with us again in 2 weeks' time as we approach Christmas. But until then, goodbye.